So good evening. I'm glad to be here today. As you know, we're continuing our study in the book of Daniel. And last time that we studied Daniel, we went through chapter 6 specifically. And I believe that for chapter 7, we might need to spend a little bit more time on chapter 7. And so this might turn, into a part 1 and part 2. And so we're going to see how far we can go with chapter 7. One of the things that I would like to do before we start looking into the different beasts that we have in chapter 7 is to get a sense of what time in history was this taking place. And so Daniel and Revelation, the book on Daniel and Revelation tells us that this is the same Belshazzar when talking about the king that is mentioned in chapter 5, and so we already talked about that. And chronologically, therefore, this chapter follows chapter 5, but chronological order has been disregarded in order that the historical part of the book might stand by itself, and the prophetic part on which we now enter might not be interrupted by the writings of that nature. And so right around this time, Belshazzar's was around 553 and 552 BC, and that is around the same time that Daniel receives this vision. And so if you remember from chapter 2, the king actually gets a vision, gets a dream. He calls Daniel when he can recall the dream. And now Daniel is receiving this vision. And when we look at the different beasts that are represented here, we're going to find out that it's exactly the same kingdoms that were revealed to King Nebuchadnezzar. And so this was also between 553 and 552 BC. Now, Haskell, in his book in page 82, in the book he wrote called Daniel the Prophet, he gives us a little bit of a glimpse as to what's the main theme of Daniel chapter 7. And he says, by a continuous chain of events, the prophet gives the history of the days of Babylon to the great investigative judgment, which is the central theme of the chapter. And so one of the things that I think makes chapter 7 really special is that Daniel in this vision is getting pretty much like a summary of what's going to happen all the way until the investigative judgment. And so he gets all of this packed into chapter 7. He goes on to say that at the age of 85, after 67 years or 53 years of court life, with all its allurements and the natural tendency of the human nature to sink to a purely physical existence, his eye of faith was so undimmed that at the bidding of Michael Gabriel could carry Daniel into heaven itself, there to behold the Father and the Son in the final work of the sanctuary above. And so you can imagine the position that Daniel found himself. Think about Daniel as one of the most important statesmen, let's say, in the U.S. Think about the Secretary of State, somebody that is there, in the midst of the action. He's actually witnessing prophecy fulfill itself. You can imagine Daniel being in countless meetings and realizing that the prophecy that had been given to Nebuchadnezzar was actually taking place. And so with all of this that he's experiencing, Haskell actually says that he could have actually been carried away, with his position. And yet, he's able to, with the eye of faith, see what's actually going to be happening in the future. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, it says, but as it is written, I have not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. And so now we're going to get into the vision that Daniel had. And so this one is found in Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. And I'll apologize for the small letters here. I promise you it gets better. All the other ones, the font is actually bigger. But it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea, and the four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from the other. And so before we actually get into who those beasts represented, we will first go ahead and understand biblically what are some of the imagery that Daniel is using in this vision. And so the first one that we see here is that he sees 4 winds. He also sees a great beast, and so we're going to see what that actually means. In the same book, in another book by Smith, page 113 through 114, speaking about this vision, it says, all scripture language is to be taken literally unless there exists some good reason for supposing it to be figurative. And all that is figurative is to be interpreted by that which is literal. All right, and so obviously when we look at Daniel chapter 7, we know this is figurative. In the book Unfolding Daniel's Prophecies by Anderson, he says apocalyptic prophecy is one of the most unique forms of literature, conveying its message in signs and symbols. This style of literature that the Jews had, it was very similar. It was one of the ways that they used in order to hide certain meanings. There are some Jewish scholars that even tell us that this was their way of communicating a message so some of the occupying forces would not know what it meant. And so this was one way that they used to write. When we go to Daniel chapter 7, verse 17, it says, these great beasts are four kings which shall arise out of the earth. And so we're going to look at in a bit what the winds represented. We're going to look also what the sea represented. But we know that the 4 beasts represented kings. And as we know, each king will need a kingdom. In Daniel 7:23, it says, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth. And so now we're going to get a quick summary of the beasts in the vision that Daniel actually had. The very first one, of course, is Babylon. And if you notice, when you go ahead and line up the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, is going to correlate specifically with this vision that Daniel has in chapter 7. So the first kingdom and the first beast that we have is Babylon. We see that Babylon, the way that he sees Babylon, is depicted as the lion with 2 wings. And the very next one that we see here is Medo-Persia, which is the bear, and it has 3 ribs in his mouth. And then the third one is Greece, and as you can see from this beautiful picture, you have 4 heads, and you also have 4 wings as well. And then finally we have Rome, right? And so if you would compare this vision with Nebuchadnezzar's statue, Rome, if you remember, was what? Rome was represented by the two legs, and then in this case we're going to have Rome, and we also have the horns with it. All right. So the book Daniel Revelation, he continues to say, these beasts do not rise all at once, but consecutively, as they are spoken of at first, second, etc. The last one is in existence when all earthly scenes are brought to an end by the final judgments. And so again, beasts represent kingdoms. And now we're going to look from the book of Daniel and Revelation. And it says, the ground is passed over again and again, that additional characteristics may be brought out. One example that we have is when we look at the kingdom of Babylon, the only information that we had from the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had was what? The main thing that we got from that dream was that that kingdom, Babylon, was going to be very, very rich. Hence, the head was made of gold. But now with the vision that Daniel has, it's a little bit different. It gives us a little bit more information. Right off the bat, we know that Babylon is going to be very speedy in its conquest. At least we see that it has 2 wings. And so we're going to get into that in a bit. So, and additional facts and features may be presented. It is thus that we have line upon line. Here, earthly governments are viewed as represented in the light of heaven. Their true character is shown by the symbol of wild and ravenous beasts. So now let's look at what the winds and sea represent. In the book of Jeremiah, it gives us a hint as to what a Jewish person might interpret when reading the vision that Daniel had. So in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 32 and 33 says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, evil shall go forth from nation to nation, and a great whirlwind shall be raised up from the coasts of the earth." Verse 33, "And the slain of the Lord shall be at that day from one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. They shall not be lamented, neither gathered nor buried. They shall be dung upon the ground." So what do you think that winds would symbolize from this verse? What do you think winds would symbolize? If it's not too clear, we're going to go again to Jeremiah, chapter 4, verse 11 through 13. And let's specifically focus on verse 12. It says, "At that time shall it be said to his people and Jerusalem, a dry wind of the high places in the wilderness toward the daughter of my people, not to fan nor to cleanse, even a full wind from those places shall come unto me. Now also will I give sentence against them." Going on to verse 13, he says, "Behold, he shall come up as clouds, and his chariots shall be as a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe unto us, for we are spoiled." So winds, when we look at the context that Jeremiah is writing here, winds simply mean strife. And so we have different things that he's mentioning here, chariots, he's mentioning horses. So all of these things represent war. In the book Daniel and Revelation, he goes on to say that winds denote strife, and war is further evident from a consideration of the vision itself. "For as a result of the striving of the winds, kingdoms arise and fall, and these events are accomplished through political strife." And so as we continue to go with Daniel's vision, wind will now represent strife or political strife. And what about the sea? For this, we're going to go to Revelation chapter 17, verse 15. And it says, "And he said unto me that waters which thou sawest were where the whore sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." So waters represent simply people, represent population. Again, when we go to Isaiah 17, 12, and 13, it says, "Woe to the multitude of many peoples, which make a noise like the noise of the seas, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters." So again, in Hebrew culture, or in their language, when they mentioned, seas, for example, in poetry, it simply meant a lot of people. So now let's look at the first beast. And so the first beast that Daniel sees, in verse 4, it says, "The first was like a lion, and it had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings therefore were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon his feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it." So very interesting here about Babylon. So we know that this beast represented Babylon, but now it's giving us a little bit more of a detail. And so what happens to Babylon according to the vision that Daniel has here? The first one we see is that he has wings. And then the next one that we notice here is that at some point he stands up like a man, and then something happens to Babylon. What is the very last part? All of a sudden he stands like a man, and now a man's heart is given to him. So what could that mean? What could that mean? In Jeremiah 50, verse 17, it tells us, and we also see how Jeremiah uses a lion to depict Babylon. It says, "Israel is scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. The first king of Assyria has devoured him. And last, this Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, hath broken his bones." And so we see that Assyria absorbs Babylon, and we actually have some archaeological evidence of that as well. In recent years, archaeologists have unearthed a number of sculptured winged lions among the ruins of ancient Babylon. And so if you go to some of the museums in Europe, you will be able to see that this imagery was used in Babylon quite a bit. So now let's talk a little bit about the wings. What do the wings actually represent? In the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 6 through 10, it says, "For lo, I raised up the Chaldeans," or the Babylonians, "that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs." And so the way that Habakkuk depicts the Babylonians is as being what? As a very hasty nation. He goes on to say in verses 8, "Their horses are also swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from far. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat." And so again, the wings here are denoting that they were going to be very quick. When we compare it later on with Greece, how many wings did Greece have? So Greece had 4, and so we're going to deduce that the Greeks were going to be even faster in conquering. He goes on to say in verse 10, "And they shall scoff at the kings, and the princes shall not be scorned unto them. They shall deride every stronghold. They shall heap dust and take it." And so this is what the wings actually represented. Again, from Haskell, in his book in page 90, it says, "Before Babylon was known as an independent kingdom, while it was still a subject province of Assyria, Habakkuk, a prophet of Israel, had been given a view of its work, which shows the force of the symbol of a lion with the eagle's wings. Speaking to Israel, he tells them of a work so wonderful that they will not believe it when told." But then something happens. We're also told from Daniel's visions that his wings are actually plucked up. And something else happens in verse 4. It says that after the wings are plucked up, he stands up like a man, and he's also given a man's heart. So what would you say means when Daniel has this vision? It's saying that he's going to stand up like a man, and all of a sudden he's going to be giving a man's heart. So let's see what David has to say in the book of Psalms. In Psalms chapter 22, verse 13, it says, "They open their mouths against me as ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels." And so how is David depicting himself when put up against the lion? How is he depicting himself? David here is depicting himself as somebody that has just, and we're going to use very descriptive words here. When you go to the original Hebrew, what the last sentence actually means is that David was very, very afraid, and he actually had a little accident, right? What is it saying here? The very last one, it says, he says, "They opened their mouths against me as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint." So he was really afraid. It seems that he's shaking. And then he adds what? "My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels." And so anyway, so the whole point is that he was really afraid that he actually has a bit of a bathroom accident here, right? And so when we compare this to Daniel 7:4, what we understand is that at some point Babylon was going to be conquered. They were no longer going to be hasty, as the prophecy said, and also they were going to be very fearful, similar to what David is describing himself when actually being put up against the lion. Now, at this point, I'm going to switch just to our next part, and we're actually going to get into a little bit more into the history of the next kingdoms. So, now we're going to look at what happens with Babylon and their decline. So right after that, in the book of Daniel and Revelation, it says, "Such was emphatically the case with the nation during the closing years of its history, when it had become enfeebled and effeminate through wealth and luxury." So something actually happens to Babylon And I want you to put that in contrast with what is actually happening today. In the book here, it tells us that something was happening in the kingdom of Babylon, and it was a symptom that it was about to fail. So it says, such was emphatically the case with the nation during the closing years of its history, when it had become what? It became enfeebled, and it also became what else? The very last part, it says, it became effeminate through wealth and luxury. And so, as they were coming close to the end of their kingdom, they began to have some issues as well, to the ones that we're currently seeing here in the U.S. Going back to the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 11, it says, then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over and offend, imputing this power unto God. And so now we're going to look at the heart, that part of the vision where Daniel talks about that he was going to be given a man's heart. And so if you remember, before Babylon actually falls, what was the first thing that happened? They're having this party, and one of the ways that the Bible describes the king, Belshazzar, and his experience was exactly to what David describes in the book of Psalms. The king, when he begins to see this writing on the wall, literally also begins to shake. And so this is how the prophecy was going to be fulfilled. And again, when we go to Daniel chapter 5, it says, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so as we looked at a couple of chapters ago, the Medes and the Persians come into Babylon, and in verse 30 it says, was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom. So history tells us that they come through the river, they diverted the river, they come through the city, and the Babylonians themselves simply don't put up a fight, and it was very easy for the Medo-Persians to take over. And so again, this vision was given around 553 to 552 BC. And so now we're going to go to the very next beast, which is found in verse chapter 5. And it says, and behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. And so again, the bear represented Medo-Persia. And the book Daniel and Revelation tells us about this kingdom. The bear was inferior to the lion. Medo-Persia fell short of Babylon in wealth and magnificence and the brilliancy of its career. And so obviously, Medo-Persia was not as great as Babylon, but we're going to look at some of their strong points as well. And so the bear is characterized as one that is very vicious. And we also see that it had 3 ribs. And so what did those 3 ribs actually represent? So the book Daniel and Revelation tells us that the 3 ribs perhaps signify the 3 provinces of Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt, as you can see there in the map, which were especially ground down and oppressed by the power. And so according to Smith, it is very possible that these 3 ribs that are found in the bear's mouth represented these 3 cities, which were one of the ones that were under the heaviest oppression from the Medo-Persians. Haskell goes on to say the history of this empire, given in the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel, and the study of that chapter together with the 13th and 21st chapter of Isaiah, will reveal the bear-like character of the nation which arose and devoured much flesh. Smith goes on to explain that the character of the power is well represented in the bear. The Medes and the Persians were cruel, rapacious, robbers, and spoilers of the people, as already noticed in the exposition of chapter 2. This kingdom dated from the overthrow of Babylon by Cyrus. So they were very cruel, and so their kingdom came right about 538 BC. The very next one that we have is the four-winged leopard. Daniel 7 verse 6 says, "After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of its four wings of a fowl. The beast had also four heads, and dominion was given to it." And so again, here we're giving a little bit more details about the kingdom of Greece. And the first one that we notice is that as opposed to Babylon, this beast has four wings, so it's twice as fast, and it also has four heads. And so when we go to Greece, we see that the leopard is very quick, and then on top of that, you add the four wings. And Smith actually tells us that the leopard itself is a swift-footed beast, but this was not sufficient to represent the career of the nation, which is symbolized in this respect. It must have wings in addition. And so we know a little bit about the history of the Greeks and also Alexander the Great, and history tells us that they were very quick in conquering. He goes on to say 2 wings. The number the lion had were not sufficient. It must have 4. This would denote unparalleled celebrity of movement, which we find to be historically true of the Grecian kingdom. The conquests of Grecia under Alexander have no parallel in historic annals for suddenness and rapidity. And so he goes on to say that all the way from Macedonia to the Ganges, which river Alexander nearly approached, is computed at least 1,100 leagues, or close to 3,300 miles. So just to give us a little bit of context, if you measure from Roanoke all the way to California, that's approximately 2,500 miles, give or take. And so just put that into perspective, that's way more than the amount of, that's less than what Alexander actually extended himself to. It says here, the extent of Alexander's conquest was staggering, stretching from Macedonia in Europe all the way to the Ganges rivers in India, a distance of over 3,300 miles or 5,311 kilometers. So, from here to Roanoke, all the way to California, and even more. That's how far he reached. And he goes on to say, add this to the various turnings in Alexander's marches, first from the extremity of Sicilia, where the battle of Issus was fought, to the temple of Jupiter Ammon in Libya, and his returning from thence to Tyre, a journey of 300 leagues, or equivalent to 900 miles, at least, and as much, at least for the windings of his route in different places. So he actually went through a lot of territory. He also says that we shall find that Alexander, in less than 8 years, marched his army upward of the 1,700 leagues, more than 5,100 miles, without including his return to Babylon. And so he was very quick in the way that he was able to conquer. And on top of that, we see that he also had, this beast also had 4 heads. And right at the end of Alexander the Great's life, his kingdom actually gets divided into 4, and his kingdom actually gets divided into 4 sections, with his 4 generals taking over. And so we have Cassander, we also have Lysimachus and Ptolemy, and he was taking care of Egypt, Lydia, and Arabia. And we also have Seleucus, and so he was in charge of Syria and some of the eastern regions as well. And so his kingdom gets divided into 4, hence the 4 heads of the leopard. And so exactly, prophecy is fulfilled. It says, thus, accurately were the words of the prophet fulfilled, as Alexander left no available successor. Why did not the huge empire break up into countless petty fragments? Why into just 4 parts and not more? Because the prophecy had said that there should be 4. And so we see here that the prophecy fulfilled exactly to the T. And so the Grecian Empire came right around 331 BC. And so we're going to be spending a little bit more time in this 4th beast. And so in verse 7, it says, "After this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before, and it had 10 horns." And so one of the things that the vision that Daniel has shows us about the Roman kingdom is that this beast was going to, or in this kingdom, was going to be very different. If you look at the Babylonians and, the Medo-Persians and the Greeks, they were not going to be anything close to what this 4th beast was going to accomplish. And in this vision, Daniel makes it very clear that it's terrible, it's very, very strong. If you think that Babylon was strong, if you think that the Greeks were strong, this kingdom was going to be even stronger. And it also tells us that it was going to do what? And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And so the 10 horns are actually going to be similar to what we see in the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. If you remember, you had the 2 legs, which was made of iron, and then the feet was made of iron and clay, and you also had the 10 toes. And so here we have 10 horns, which is represents exactly the same thing. Now, of course, we know that Jesus was born during this time, and Luke 2:1, it tells us that, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus, that all the world should be taxed." Many times when we look at our current situation and the things that are going on in politics, we tend to think that what happens here in the U.S. is very unique and that perhaps it has never happened before. But there's one verse that I'm always reminded of, and it is the verse that says that there is nothing new under the sun. And so the very same things that were going on in the Roman government, we're also going to see them. These days. And so during that time, what is Caesar trying to accomplish? He wants to tax people. And the best way to do that is to do what? He sends out this decree, and he wants to get people together to come to their hometown so they can be taxed. And so now let's look a little bit deeper into what this 4th kingdom was. And in verse 23, it says, "The 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces." One thing that I want us to really remember about this 4th beast is that how can I put it? Even though we're living during the time of this 4th beast, oftentimes when we look at this beast, we focus on the horns, right? What the horns were actually going to do. But we have to remember that the horns are part of what? The horns are part of this great and terrible beast. And so all the characteristics that we see here in Daniel chapter 7 in regards to this 4th beast are going to apply as well to the horns. So going back to Daniel and Revelation by Smith, it says, "But he was astonished at this 4th beast," talking about Daniel, "so unnatural." Okay, it says so unnatural and dreadful, for the further we come down the stream of time, the further it is necessary to depart from nature in forming symbols to represent accurately the degenerating governments of this earth. So what is Smith telling us here? That as we come to this very last beast, there is really no language that can be used in order to describe this terrible kingdom other than this terrible beast. He goes on to say, "The lion is a production of nature, but it must have the unnatural addition of 2 wings to represent the kingdom of Babylon. The bear, also, we find it in nature, but as a symbol of Medo-Persia, an unnatural ferocity must be denoted by the insertion of 3 ribs into his mouth. He goes on to say, so the leopard is a beast of nature, but fitly to represent Grecia, there is a departure from the nature in respect to the wings and the number of heads. But nature furnishes no symbol which can fitly illustrate the 4th kingdom. So all the other kingdoms that we looked at, all the, the jealousy that we looked at in the previous studies, and all the dynamics that were at play behind these kingdoms are very natural, are very human-like. But when it comes to this 4th beast, it is very unhuman, is very uncharacteristic of nature. That the only way that God could actually reveal this to Daniel was by giving him a depiction of a beast which was very terrible, and there's actually no beast in nature that could actually compare to that. It says, a beast, the likeness of which never was seen, is taken, a beast dreadful and terrible, with nails of brass and teeth of iron, so cruel, rapacious, and fierce, that from mere love of oppression it devoured and brake in pieces and trampled its victims beneath its feet. And so that was the exact case of the Roman government. So we're going to pause it around right here, but I want us to look a little bit on what the government and the kingdom of Rome actually made possible. So Rome actually was very good with building very fine roads. And I believe that that was one of the reasons why the gospel actually went very far, because they had a really good road system. They also had a very comprehensive law system. And one of the things that I recently found out is that toward the end of the Roman government, they were very good in keeping their citizens happy. That Rome, the Roman kingdom, was actually the first one to have its welfare system, right? And so, for example, if a Roman was a Roman citizen didn't have work, Rome actually had a way to make sure that that individual was actually getting some money in order to live. And so this was happening actually toward the end of the Roman government. And so they were very good at making sure that their people were happy. And so the reasoning behind this was that if their citizens had food, had shelter, they would be happy and they would not revolt, right? And so anyway, next time we're actually going to go a little bit further with some of the things that were going on during the Roman government. And we'll pause it right there. But I want to end with one note. When we look at all the kingdoms and how they fell, there's a couple of statistics that came up, and speaking about how politics and events in the political field affect Americans. And so in 2024, they made a study. And they found out that right around election time in the U.S., Americans will experience a certain degree of depression. And those that are going through, that are medicated or going through different mental health treatment, you will have a little bit of a spike in suicide when it comes to right around election time. So for a lot of people, it means a lot. And so one of the things that the prophecy actually gives us is that even though things might not be looking good in the political world, one of the promises that we have at the end, and so we'll see it in our next study, one of the promises that is given to Daniel at the end of this vision is that there's going to be another kingdom that is going to come, and is going to be a kingdom of peace. And all the terrible things that the other kingdoms were doing, this kingdom is not going to do it. And so it's the very same thing that we see in chapter 2. At the end of this kingdom, what happens? Of all of these kingdoms, what happens? You have the rock that comes, destroys the statue. And this is the hope that we have as Christians, that even though whatever is going on in the world, as crazy and unpredictable as it may seem, we all have the promise that Christ is coming again, and that we're going to be in a place where all of these terrible things are not going to be a reality anymore. Amen?